Quisiera dar la bienvenida ahora al señor Barney Afako, miembro de la Comisión sobre los Derechos Humanos en Sudán del Sur. Invito a los participantes que deseen formular observaciones y hacer preguntas al ponente a que pulsen el botón de sus micrófonos en los próximos 3 minutos, transcurridos los cuales se cerrará la lista. El límite de tiempo para cada orador se anunciará antes de dar la palabra al primer orador. Le doy las gracias por su cooperación. Invito ahora al miembro de la Comisión sobre los Derechos Humanos en Sudán del Sur a formular una declaración introductoria. Señora Afako, tiene usted la palabra.
Thank you, Madam Chair, Ms. Myra Soto, distinguished members of the committee and delegates. On behalf of the chairperson of our commission, Ms. Yasmin Suka, and my colleague, Mr. Carlos Castersana Fernandez, who's here, we're honored to brief you for the first time on the human rights situation in South Sudan, in line with our report presented to the Human Rights Council in March 2024. First of all, we want to thank the government of South Sudan for its cooperation with our commission and with our staff who are based in Juba. Madam Chair, after decades of a difficult struggle for self-determination, South Sudan emerged in July 2011 as the world's youngest country, but with a divided and highly militarized society. Tragically, its leaders returned that country to war, thereby dashing hopes for the emergence of a peaceful, prosperous, and democratic society. And conflict continues to inflict a heavy cost on South Sudan and its people. Hundreds of thousands have been killed and millions forcibly displaced. Civilians have been targeted and traumatized, with women and girls systematically subjected to horrific sexual violence. Nearly 2.3 million South Sudanese are refugees. More than 2 million are internally displaced. Most of the population requires humanitarian assistance. All parts of South Sudan have experienced subnational violence, often with ethnic dimensions stoked by elites. In Western Equatoria, terrified victims described to the Commission horrific attacks, including killings, sexual violence, recruitment and use of children in armed forces, abductions of women and children, and other cruel and inhuman treatment. Although the 2018 revitalized peace agreement laid the foundations for recovery and transformation, corrupt leaders have failed to pursue peace, accountability, and democratic transformation. Instead, they have escalated their competition for power and resources. Their economic crimes and gross mismanagement have directly fueled violence and repression and deprived millions of basic rights to food, health, and education. Despite being rich in oil resources and arable land, South Sudan has therefore remained vulnerable to shocks. War in Sudan has driven another 800,000 people into the country while disrupting its oil exports and plunging the economy into deeper crisis. Climate-induced flooding has caused further displacement and deepened the humanitarian crisis in the country. By diverting billions of oil dollars for their personal gain, unaccountable elites have reduced South Sudanese to precarious and dignified lives, depriving them of basic necessities. Women and girls are deeply marginalized in the society and have borne the brunt of conflict, including appalling levels of sexual and other forms of violence. They fall behind across all social indicators, including health and education. Girls are frequently subjected to early marriage. Children's lives have been blighted by conflict, predation, and neglect. They're targeted through recruitment and abduction. South Sudan has one of the highest levels of infant mortality and acute malnutrition in the world. Education is woefully underfunded, with less than 40% of children starting school, and of those, less than 1/3 completing primary education. Less than 10% of eligible children are in secondary education. Girls fare the worst. Madam Chair, without effective systems for investigating, prosecuting, or ensuring remedies for violations, perpetrators, including the corrupt, are emboldened. A climate of impunity prevails. In the under-resourced justice sector, police, prosecutors, and judicial officers are demoralized. Like most other civil servants, they've gone unpaid for months. South Sudanese live under the shadow of repression and surveillance. The National Security Services operatives constantly monitor, harass, target, and abduct civil society and perceived political opponents, including those outside the country. The media is subjected to censorship and reprisals. South Sudan's leaders have consistently failed to implement the 2018 peace agreement, including the unification of rival forces, transitional justice processes for dealing with past violations, the construction of an effective justice system, the establishment of robust mechanisms for economic management, and the adoption of a permanent constitution, which would be South Sudan's first. In September 2024, they once again postponed elections after failing to make the necessary preparations. These leaders have stalled the transition and are stealing South Sudan's future. They must urgently change course. What should be done? First, the leaders must urgently promote a credible and participatory constitution-making process which would provide the basis for the country's first national elections. Secondly, they must promote accountability and recovery by investing in the national justice system, by implementing legislation for establishing the Commission for Truth, Reconciliation, and Healing, as well as the Compensation and Reparation Authority. But they must also engage the African Union urgently to establish the hybrid court for South Sudan in order to pursue appropriate criminal justice for the most serious offenses. Thirdly, they must stop the plunder. Corruption and economic management are depriving South Sudanese of their core rights. The stolen resources must be returned and perpetrators punished. Fourthly, they must protect and respect the rights and dignity of women and girls who remain deeply marginalized and unsafe in the country. Next, leaders must dismantle systems of repression by ceasing arbitrary arrests, detentions, enforced disappearances, and the suppression of fundamental freedoms of association, assembly, expression, and information, particularly by the National Security Services. Lastly, the leaders must invest in peace and end violent competition, including subnational violence. Armed and political groups outside the transition must be engaged, including through the ongoing Tumaini initiative facilitated and supported by the government of Kenya. In conclusion, Madam Chair, we urge this Assembly not to abandon South Sudan, but to renew its support for the South Sudanese people by demanding that their leaders take concrete corrective steps to conclude the political transition credibly and to protect, respect, and fulfill the civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights of its citizens. I thank you, Madam Chair.
Doy las gracias al miembro de la Comisión sobre los Derechos Humanos en Sudán del Sur. Ahora daré la palabra a quienes deseen formular preguntas u observaciones al señor Afako. Conforme a la práctica establecida, quisiera pedir a las delegaciones que limiten sus observaciones a 3 minutos. Le doy las gracias por su amable cooperación. Doy ahora la palabra a la distinguida representante de Noruega y a continuación al distinguido